very often we convince ourselves that we are not the villains, it's the British who are the villains. I mean, it's partially true, right? So there is, of course, historically speaking, factually speaking, there is no denying that the British did play a certain game in the subcontinent in the 19th century. But it is not to say that it's only the British who did that. So what is it that I'm trying to argue? What I'm trying to argue is that the British did something because they saw the possibility of doing that. Try to understand. So in the 19th century, to give you a quick example, when we think about divide and rule policy, what's the moment? Is there a moment in modern history of South Asia or colonial India where, or is there a moment to which you can trace the beginning of, say, communalism? है कोई ऐसा मोमेंट? तो जब हम ये कहते हैं कि साहब डिवाइड एंड रूल पॉलिसी इन्होंने इख्तियार की थी, so the British adopted divide and rule policy, what is the reference that we have in mind? What makes us say this? Partition? No. Oh, Muslim League. So Muslim League is 1906, right? 1905. 1906, yes. Hindu Mahasabha is 1950. Yes. Yeah. Very much. 1905. But even before that, so these are important events, right? So whether you talk about the establishment of the Muslim League, or you talk about the partition of Bengal, which was very much carried along the lines of religion, but what is actually more important is, so there are historians who very beautifully argued. So there's a brilliant historian whose name is Rajmohan Gandhi. He happens to be, he is, not happens to be, he is Gandhi's grandson, a great historian. So there's a book that he wrote, A Revenge and Reconciliation, and in that book he makes a very interesting argument. And the argument that he makes is this. He says that as we Indians were fighting for freedom, we were also heading towards partition. So freedom struggle was carried out in a way that partition almost became a part of that package. So we were trying to shoo the British away, but in the course of that struggle, what we were perhaps not aware of, I don't know if we were aware of, I won't comment on that. Maybe some of us were aware of that. But for the most part, we were not aware of the fact that this was going to lead to a very violent end, which is partition. 1947, several lakh people dead, millions homeless, went homeless, and ridiculously violent an episode in the history of human race. So the argument is that it all starts in, to give you a very quick thing. So rather than just, entertaining this idea that, yeah, the British did this, we were all, brotherly towards each other and whatnot. That's all nonsense. The point is, in India, in the 19th century, communities had begun to develop differences with each other. So in 1857, of course, we all know about the major event, First War of Independence, revolt, mutiny, rebellion. Now, 1857 is a very interesting moment in the sense that the British actually become very skeptical primarily of Muslims. Why? Because when the British enter the subcontinent, presumably the power is Muslim power. Although, this fellow is good for nothing. But for the most part, it is said that, you've taken power from the Muslims. So the British remained very skeptical towards the Muslims. They always doubted the Muslim or the Muslim loyalty to the crown. Now, after 1857, when things begin to fall in order, there is a new thing that emerges, which is that the Indians are allowed. There's a new act, which is about Indians' entry into government service. This is also the time when the Indian civil service, comes to the fore. Now, Indians are allowed to get into government service. Now, how do you get into government service? So one thing that happens after 1857 is that both the communities begin to demonstrate their loyalty to the British Crown. And this is a very interesting thing. So let's say I belong to religion A and you belong to religion B, and we both are vying for the same government position. Now, what do? I prove my loyalty, but I just don't have to prove my loyalty. I also have to say a thing or two about your not so loyal position. And it is exactly this way that it works in the 1860s. Communities actually begin to demonstrate differences. So some kind of othering happens. Now the British are, of course, they are ridiculously shrewd, cunning, a race. So they instantly catch this. So they realize that already there are fissures, or there are gaps, there are these gulfs between these communities, and they simply exploit these gulfs. So it is not that one fine day some British administrator decided that let's divide and rule. It is not so simple. The subcontinent, the communities in the subcontinent were already, in some senses, becoming somewhat hostile to each other. And the British simply took note of that, and they realized that there is an opportunity for us. We can very well we can kind of further intensify the differences and make use of this. So they are partially to be blamed, right? So it is not that we were all in hopelessly in love with each other, and the British simply came and forcefully did us apart. Of course, that was never the case. The point is, but it is also not to say that people were killing each other, right? So it was not that violent either. But communities had developed their own sense of identity, and they also developed their own sense of politics. So, for instance, 1905, Muslim League's emergence outside Congress. So Congress was making a case for national politics, right? Indian National Congress. But people like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and others in the late 19th century, they said that there's nothing national about it because the Muslim representation is not going to be taken care of. And then you have an entire league of Muslim leaders who begin to talk about politics in a different way. Things are not that different because when you do your modern history, this is all you will read about: the Lucknow Pact, the Unity Conference. So very often Muslim League and Congress work together. But of course, gradually, 1927-28 onwards, Muslim League has its own political existence, and Congress has its own. And of course, 1937 onwards, you have major differences, right? To come back to what I was saying, that when we are discussing communalism and when we discuss the origins of communalism, please remember that it doesn't that swiftly start with divide and rule policy. Divide and rule policy is something that is a result of already existing schisms or already existing gaps or divides or fissures in Indian society. So we can't just straight away, attribute this to the British government. So So fair enough. One is, of course, divide and rule. What else do you think led to communalism in India? What else other than this? Anything else? We didn't take that up. Okay. So these are the causes. But when, for instance, oh yeah, okay, yeah, yes, okay. So there are a lot of things. So for instance, it's fascinating. If you read the 19th century stuff, then you realize that there is missionaries who are trying to convert, right? So as a response, there is a Shuddhi movement or the Arya Samaj movement. So religious communities are becoming more and more conscious of their identity. And this leads to, as I become more conscious of my identity, I also become conscious of the fact that how is it that I'm different from you, right? This is how it works. So the more I become conscious of my, say, Muslim identity or Hindu identity, the more I also become conscious of how I am different from you. This is exactly something that's happening in the 19th century. And of course, in the early 19th century, this is very subtle. It's not very loud. It's very elementary. But gradually, as new developments happen, so you have the revolt, you have the Queen's Proclamation Act, you have Indian civil service, you have, the middle class, you have education, modernism. As a result of these developments, what happens is that these differences become more and more pronounced, which is why in the 19th century, towards the end, you have actually the first communal riots in 1894, if I remember correctly, which is around cow slaughter, right? So there are riots. So in the late 19th century, there are riots, right, which is the beginning. What is also, before I dictate few things, what is also important to remember is that religion as an idea is also a very modern idea, which means that in the 18th century, maybe not 18th century, let's say 16th century, 17th century, people were not very particular about their religious identity. People were absolutely chilled out in their own zones. It is only in the 19th century that people think about their religious identity more seriously. To give you an example, if you think about many of these conflicts that you might read on about in medieval history, so many of these conflicts or wars where you have one king who is a Muslim and another king who is a Hindu. So in modern world, we actually begin to think, or we are told to think about it in terms of war between two religions. So the fact of the matter is, it was not a religious conflict. It was actually a what conflict? Well, not as much political conflict, in the sense that, so for instance, let's say if Babur is fighting against some Hindu whatever, there are many Muslim chieftains who are actually siding with the Hindu king, and there are many Hindu princes or whoever, they are actually siding with Babur. And this happened in the case of Akbar, this happened in the case of Humayun's fight. I mean, there were also people like, I mean, Humayun was fighting against another Muslim dynasty. Babur was fighting against another Muslim dynasty, and so on. So religion as a marker of identity is also very modern, which is why, and this is where the important point is, people like Bipin Chandra, an eminent historian, unfortunately not alive anymore, they say that communalism is a modern, which means that this whole idea of distinguishing myself from you on the basis of religion is a quintessentially, categorically modern phenomenon. You couldn't imagine any of this in, say, 14th century, 15th century, where people were exchanging ideas, mixing up cultures in very, very interesting ways. It's only in the modern time. And in India, when we discuss the modern age, we primarily start with the early 19th century. So Ram Mohan Roy essentially becomes the starting point of that colonial modernity. So remember this, that communalism is therefore a modern phenomenon. So its roots have to be somewhere from the 19th century. So now we can start with the causes. The first cause, you can write this down. Divide and rule policy. So I'm starting with the commonsensical. Divide and rule policy of the British. The British divided the people of various communities. The British divided the people of various communities of India and spread the feeling of distrust and spread the feeling of distrust in each of the communities Full stop. This is in many ways the starting point of communalism in modern India. This is in many ways the starting point of communalism in modern India. Right, so this is your first point. But as I said, please remember, I mean, of course, we don't necessarily write any of this in the mains examination because I don't think we are required to. But I think this clarity needs to be there, that it was not just the British. The British did something because they saw the possibility of doing that. I mean, had communities being, hopelessly in love with each other, perhaps they would have done something else. I mean, they were shrewd people. They remained shrewd, actually. Not all of them, of course. But so they had to do something about, carrying out their rule in India, the imperialistic aspirations in India. So this is the starting point. The second thing, before I dictate, what also happens in India in the 19th century, particularly towards the end of the 19th century, is that there are leaders like, for instance, you have someone like Tilak, right? So Lokmanya Tilak, who is an iconic leader. But what Tilak does is, in many of the gatherings, so these gatherings are meant to create a certain consciousness vis-a-vis national awakening, right? So let's say I am inviting all of you that, all right, we will gather there, right, Saturday, 5 p.m. or whatever. And why are we gathering? Because we need to think about how to free ourselves, right? So Tilak's very, very revolutionary idea, Swaraj is my birthright. Now, this whole idea of Swaraj, so we are all together, and as Indians, we are thinking about it. Now, let's say that the beginning of this whole thing is marked by some puja, right? So let's say Ganesh Aarti happens. Now, there's nothing wrong with it, and I don't think in the late 19th century, early 20th century, anybody thought about any of that. And I don't really think people have written on Tilak, but nobody has really talked about Tilak doing that consciously. But it actually led to something, right? In the sense that if you follow a particular religious ritual in relation to freedom, then what happens is you're actually drawing a connection between nation and religion, which is a very problematic connection, particularly in the case of India, because India is a house, India is a remarkable abode of various religions, right? And also of atheists, Marxists, communists, who not. So now this is something that happens in the late 19th century. Now historians are not saying that they were doing it consciously, but what happens is that as a result of some of these practices, there's a certain kind of idea of India that emerges, which is closer to one religion and not so close to another religion. So then the argument would begin that, if you are in one religion or from one religion, you are closer to nationalist aspirations. If you are from another religion, then you will have to work hard to become nationalist, right? This was the argument. So, for instance, if you're a Christian, you might not instantly become that, that sincere nationalist. If you're a Muslim, you might have to work hard. But if you're a Hindu, it's not really that difficult. When you are a Hindu, you are in India, so there's a certain connection between your religion, your nation. So this is what historians, so for instance, even Bipin Chandra and others, they have written about it. So the phrase is, you can now write it, Hindu tinge, Tinge, Hindu tinge in nationalist thought. Tinge लफ्ज सुना हुआ है आप लोगों ने? क्या तर्जुमा होगा इसका? How do you translate it? Flavor actually is the right word. I said touch, yes. It's a hint, because it's not, when you say tinge, it doesn't mean it's all, unabashedly Hindu. It's almost like खाने में नमक. लेकिन उससे एक खाने का एक पूरा मिजाज बदल जाता है. The temperament of food changes as a result of this pinch of salt. So Hindu tinge in nationalist thought. Yes, please. Yes. Yeah. Hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, it's too late to discuss this because this happened in the late 19th century. I wish we had any say in that. But just to quickly respond to that, as I said in the beginning, that maybe these leaders were not, for instance, there was an entire movement that was very much interested in what we call re-enlivening traditions, right? So you had Hindus on the one hand who were dismissing traditions, but you also had Hindus who were trying to rejuvenate or giving another life to traditions. And they were saying that from our traditions we are going to get the moral, physical strength, right? So, for instance, Bankim, in that sense, is a remarkable writer. Now, the argument is that even if we go back to past, right? Now, whose past? That's the question. So, let's say I'm a Buddhist. Now, I might not agree with you in relation to past. So, if you go back to a Vedic past, now my past actually is not really that old. So I am more interested in past to a certain extent. Let's say I'm a Christian, a Syrian Christian, or a Muslim. Now my past starts in the 8th century. My past starts in the 4th century AD or 2nd century AD. So I think this whole idea of past is also a very problematic idea. I mean, to a certain extent, can we think of a past where all of us were together? And if we can't, then I think perhaps, and this is what Nehru was also trying to do, he said, forget all of that. Although in Discovery of India, he has beautifully written on India's past. Slightly problematic on the Muslim bit, but it's a very good book. But Nehru is more geared towards the present. He doesn't really talk about what the Guptas did. I mean, he passingly refers to all that. But he says, let's get geared ourselves towards a more meaningful, rooted present so as to have a more progressive, rewarding future. Right. So this is Nehru's agenda. Gandhi, on the other hand, is very different. Gandhi is actually invoking past. Tagore is invoking past. Ambedkar hates past because past for Ambedkar, as any sensible Dalit, not just any Dalit, past is all about exploitation because the India's past for Dalits is about exploitation, right? So this is what I was saying the other day. I don't know in this class or somewhere else, maybe in my university, that Amartya Sen's whole idea of argumentative Indian was ripped apart by many scholars. They said, what the hell is this argumentative Indian? The Dalits were never allowed to enter into any of the monasteries or schools. So who is this Indian who is argumentative? He's of course an upper caste, right? So Ambedkar never talked about what we call civilization. He hated the word. He talked about nation. Because nation is something that is modern. Nation is something that offers rights. Civilization does not have rights. Civilization is this very glorious idea of people living together and doing poetry and whatnot. But Dalits were never allowed to do any of that. So this whole idea of glorious past again is a very problematic idea. Whether it is invoked in the Muslim community or any other community. The fact of the matter is there is no glorious past. It's just a construction. Because even if you go to the glorious past and you read whatever is written, you will realize that many people at that time were persecuted. Right? So a lot of people could not say a lot of things that they wanted to say, couldn't do a lot of things. For instance, the condition of women in glorious past was horrible. Right? So I mean, if we talk about the glorious past of the Muslim community, the condition of women was terrible. So then for whom is it glorious? So it's glorious for us men and not necessarily glorious for the entire community. But the construction is such that it is imposed on everyone. So all the Muslims will be told that, listen, the era of Spain, Muslim Spain was easily the most, the golden period. I think that's an absurd idea because there were a lot of things that were happening at the same time, which were not very promising. So this whole idea of glorious past, and I'll come to this in a while there is another cause that I want to get into, which is called history. And how does history contribute to communalism? In relation to James Mill's work. So I'll come to that in more detail in a bit, but I think this is how I would look at it. That there's just no point getting into glorious stuff. That we were iconic then, we are terrible now. And forget what we were. Who cares? The point is we need to figure out what is it that we need to do right now. Right? Does that not necessarily convince you, but does that respond to the question that you were raising? Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing wrong in invoking a past, but I think in a country like India, it creates all kinds of divisions, unfortunately. Because, only when you go back to, say, 15th, 16th century, even then, so turns out my forefathers were fighting someone else's forefathers. What the hell do we do now in the 21st century, right? So I think past in the case of India can be a bit problematic, depending on who's facing. If someone who's very progressive will even find good things in the past. But someone who's hopelessly regressive will actually ruin it beyond means. Okay, so yeah, so you can write this. What is it? Hindu tinged nationalist thought. Yes, just one or two lines. During the national movement, a strong religious element. During the national movement, a strong religious element was introduced in nationalist thought. A strong religious element was introduced in nationalist thought. Full stop. It emphasized Indian culture. It emphasized ancient Indian culture and conveniently uh, excluded medieval Indian culture. Uh, full stop. Tilak used Ganesh Puja and Shivaji festival. Tilak used Ganesh Puja or Ganesh Aarti and Shivaji festival to propagate nationalism. To propagate nationalism and the anti-partition Bengal agitation in 1905, right? And the anti-partition Bengal agitation was started with dips in Ganges. And the anti-partition Bengal agitation, yani agitation against partition of Bengal. This agitation was started with dips in the holy sacred river, which is Ganges. Dips in Ganges, Ganga. अंग्रेजी में इसको हम लोग Ganga river, either ways. But in English, we always Ganges. Right now, again, one is not saying that people had some intention back then. But if you now think about it, that one is talking about freedom of India. But Ganga is of course associated with India, but a certain reference of India, right, from a certain religion. Now, other religions might not associate with Ganga as much as one particular religion would. Right? So the Christians are completely then sidelined. The Buddhists are sidelined. The Muslims are sidelined, and so on and so forth. Now, these are things that kind of lead to some kind of fissure, some kind of division within the society. The third one, communal view of Indian history. Communal view of Indian history. Now, before I dictate anything, as he was asking earlier, so in 1827, there was a book that was written. It was a 3-volume major work by James Mill. It's called History of British India, right? Now, James Mill is the first person who actually communalized, let's put it this way, who communalized Indian history. So what does James Mill do? He does something that now we call periodization. यानी हिंदुस्तानी हिस्ट्री को उन्होंने 3 अलग-अलग periods में divide किया. In any case, we divide history into 3 periods. So when we do it, we say ancient, medieval, modern. But what James Mill does, and he is of course a crooked man that way, he actually divides it in terms of religions. So, or rather, let's say civilization. So he says the Hindu period, the Muslim period, and the British/modern period. Now, the Hindu period is of course the ancient period. So he talks about good things happening during that period. Of course, he talks about few issues here and there, but for the most part, he's okay with the Hindu period. He has all the possible issues with the Muslim period, which is the medieval India. He talks about all kinds of barbaric activities, all kinds of human rights violations. Of course, human rights as an idea wasn't there then. But जितनी बुराई वो कर सकते हैं हिस्ट्री ऑफ ब्रिटिश इंडिया में, उन्होंने सबसे ज्यादा बुराई करी है medieval period की, जिसको वो कहते हैं मुस्लिम. और of course, British period तो मतलब because they consider themselves as saviors of the East. तो उनका मतलब indirectly वो ये कहना चाह रहे हैं कि if we had not come, India would have been lost beyond hope. So, good Lord, I mean, good fortune for people in the subcontinent that British finally arrived and they saved Indian people from barbarism, right? Now, why is it that you think that this man would pitch it this way? कि एक हिंदू पीरियड में वो कोई उनको ज्यादा मसला है नहीं उससे. Not to say कि मसले होने चाहिए, but he pitches things in a very, very flowery way, right? Doesn't talk about caste practices, atrocities, and so on. So the Hindu period is fine with James Mill. It is the Muslim period where everything inappropriate, immoral, barbaric is happening. And then, of course, the modern period is period of promise and hope and, progressivism. Why do you think it works that way? Why does he pitch his argument this particular way? Communal view of Indian history. Why does he do this? मुस्लिम कम्युनिटी तो खैर अर्ली मिडीवल है, हाँ, मतलब 8वीं सदी में है, और अगर पॉलिटिकली कहें तो 11वीं 12वीं सदी से. Okay, fair enough. What else? A little louder so that, yeah, he might want to. Yeah, of course, no denying that. There are no two opinions about it. He was someone who perpetuated hate through history. But why would he? Yes, yeah, yes. Okay. Yeah, first I would agree with. Second, I have my reservations because I think in the early 19th century they were not really that ambitious. But definitely, so for instance, if you look at something that I was saying, I said a while ago, that who were there in the subcontinent when the British entered? It were the Muslims, right? Although the Mughals were hardly of any consequence. You had all kinds of stakeholders in the subcontinent. You had the Marathas, the Rohilas, and who not. The Sikh Empire was very much thriving. But the British symbolically, of course, the Mughal, right? Now you're taking, so let's say I take something from you, right? Now I have to make sure that I inform my readers that you were not taking care of it, and I am the most appropriate guardian, custodian of this valuable asset called India. So British are taking it from Muslims. Now you have to write history in a way. Now imagine, let's assume for a moment that history hadn't unfolded the way it unfolded in the subcontinent. Let's say the Muslims were ruling in ancient India and then the Hindus took over. I'm just making a case here. Now James Mill has nothing against the communities as such. He's not friendly with the Hindus. He doesn't have a particular kind of animosity against them. He's writing as a typical utilitarian historian. So he has nothing to do with Hindus and Muslims. He has a certain agenda. So let's say Muslims were ruling till 11th, 12th century, and after that you had Hindu kings, one after another. Now James Mill would have reversed the entire thing. He would have talked about the Muslim rule in a through a very flowery, not so problematic prose. And for the Hindu period, he would have ripped it apart. With all kinds of injustice. Why? Because the British then in that case are taking it from the Hindus. So you have to justify yourself. And how do you justify yourself? You justify yourself by telling your audience that look, the Hindus were not taking care of it. Now we have come and we are going to see to it that this civilization reaches its creative potential, right? Or the zenith of its creative potential. So this is how communalization of Indian history happens, which is people like Romila Thapar and others argue, it's called periodization. So if you think about, say for instance, if you say the Hindu period, now what does that mean? I mean, do we only have Hindus or there are other things also happening? So what do we do about, say, other communities that are there? When you say the Muslim period, what does that mean? Does it mean that every other religious community has left the subcontinent, gone somewhere? When you say the British period, what does that mean? Right? So it's a very communally charged idea. When you are, to go back to communalism's definition, you are restricting the identity of a nation or you are restricting the identity of a civilization, right? So you are restricting Indian civilization to Hindu. You are restricting Indian civilization to Muslim. And then, of course, you're making a case for British/modern. So you can just write a line or two and then we move on to the other cause. A communal view of Indian history, a communal view of Indian history, particularly of ancient and medieval period, is also responsible for the growth of communalism. Many writers, let's say, getting writers, many British writers, many British writers in the 19th century in the 19th century restricted restricted the essence of the essence of ancient and medieval India restricted the essence of ancient and medieval India to a certain religion, to a certain religion, that is yani I dot E dot, that is Hinduism and Islam. As a result, as a result, the Hindu communal view of history, as a result, the Hindu communal view of history relied on the myth. The Hindu communal view of history relied on the myth that Indian society and culture, that Indian society and culture had reached ideal heights, in the ancient period. Ideal heights in the ancient period, and fell into permanent and continuous decay. Fell into permanent and continuous decay during the medieval period. During the medieval period, because of the Muslim rule and domination. Because of the Muslim rule and domination.